Hey everybody, it's Party Lead here with another episode of Total Breakdown. This time we see Braccus Rex lead the Dark Elves in battle against the Dwarfs of Bjarke. We begin of course with talk of composition and deployment, and as you can see right away, the Dark Elves are doing some really crazy things right now, so let's take a look at what they've got going on. They've got over here a Supreme Sorceress of Fire in charge up in the air, and right next to her we've got these two units of Dark Shards, one being the Bolt Fiends, Dark Shard with Shield, Regiment of Renown. Over here on the left, meanwhile, in the trees tucked away, we've got 3 units of Dark Shards with Shields, and then right behind them, 3 units of Harkneth Executioners, while back here, we have this Lonely Reaper Bolt Thrower hoping to get some shots in nice and early, I imagine, while all the way at the back, we have another lonely unit of the Slaanesha's Harvesters, the Doomfire Warlock Regiment of Renown. The Dwarfs, going fairly more traditional in comparison, have a Lord in charge back here in the middle, and up front, as you can see, we've got these 2 Runesmiths supporting on either flank. All the way up front, these 4 units of Thunderers hoping to fire away as the enemy approaches, and right behind them we've got these 3 units of Longbeards, a fairly capable unit. On either flank behind them we do have these Giant Slayers over here and over here, while right behind them we do have these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons here as well as over here. And finally, capping off the rear, we have these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons and these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons as well. So again, fairly traditional dwarven layout over here, though it does lack any form of artillery, so the dwarfs are going to find themselves outranged by the Reaper Bolt Thrower, and as you can see, that Reaper Bolt Thrower is already pushing forward, and so too is the rest of the Dark Elf army, especially the Supreme Sorceress, who's looking for an opportunity to get involved and trying to ensure that these Dark Shards stay hidden, but of course, unfortunately, there's not enough tree cover over here. They do get spotted right away, and it's just these 2 lonely ranged units pushing forth, so all of the dwarfs, as you can see, turn around and start focusing in on this right flank, assuming, I think, that the attack is coming from this right flank, when in reality there is of course a 2-pronged approach. We have some Dark Shards with shields coming in from here as well. Good call on those shields as well on the Dark Shards, of course, using that to stay protected from the potential ranged fire of Rangers or Thunderers or whatever it might be. And you can see again the Dark Shards find themselves in a little bit of cover, able to stay hidden, and then now they start opening fire, poking shots, these like prodding shots into these Thunderers over here, trying to cause a fair bit of damage, while the Reaper Bolt Thrower as well firing away, and excellent timing from this Runesmith on the Rune of Oath and Steel and the Rune of Negation. They're trying to reduce the damage that's coming in as they slowly creep forward towards these 2 units of Dark Shards with shields, and as far as they figure, potentially the rest of the Dark Elf army as well, but they're just about to spot these Dark Shards with shields coming in from that left flank as well. And you can see that other Runesmith as well pops the Rune of Oath and Steel and the Rune of Negation at the same time. Again, trying to keep these guys all alive and fighting as they deal with this initial skirmishing situation. You can see these Thunderers have already taken a touch of damage, and as these Dark Shards, especially with their armor-piercing missiles, continue to fire away, they will do more and more of that damage, of course. You can see back here the Supreme Sorceress looking for an opportunity to get involved, pops that Fireball, hoping to get a fair bit of hurt done in this little corner over here, gets a nice shot, a great angle as well, because of course coming in from the side on a thin, widely laid out unit, that Fireball will cut right through a bunch of these dwarfs and cause a fair bit of hurt to these Thunderers as well as the Longbeards, despite them being under the Rune of Negation's influence, as well as the extra armor, though that does wear off in just a split second as that Fireball comes through. So a good bit of damage being done. You can see back here these Thunderers as well continue to fire away at these Dark Shards, so the Dark Shards are forced to pull back into safety, eating a lot of damage here. The Rune of Wrath and Ruin goes down as well, slowing them down, making sure they're not able to get away as quickly as they would like, of course, while back here you can see the Supreme Sorceress maybe being a little too adventurous, so all of these Thunderers now turn around and start firing away at the Supreme Sorceress. She immediately tries to pull back into safety, while the Reaper Bolt Thrower fires away as well, trying to get some damage into these units that are trying to close the gaps into these Dark Shards, and the Supreme Sorceress has taken a fair bit of hurt over here, while these Dark Shards are now pulling forward away from those trees, and as a result of that, you can see we've got some of these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons splitting up from the rest of the group, splitting up from the rest of the herd as it might be, trying to shut down those Dark Shards before they're able to do too much damage, and at the same time, up front, you can see these Giant Slayers with their speed of 40 actually able to close the gap into these Dark Shards with shields really quickly. That's a speed of 40 against a speed of 33, so these Giant Slayers are hoping to have a good time while the Thunderers continue to fire away, drop these Dark Shards as they try to escape. A good job there, again, focusing down on these Dark Shards and the Bolt Fiends as well, hoping to slow them down, using those runes early on, and now just closing the gap. As you can see, these Giant Slayers don't have very far to go, while over here you can see we've got these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons trying to dive into these Dark Shards, so the Dark Shards pull back, and these Dark Shards continue to fire away into these Dwarf Warriors, causing a great deal of damage, while back here at the same time you can see the Supreme Sorceress using using the Opal Amulet, trying to increase that damage resistance, so as all those thunders fire away, she's not going to take too much hurt, but that is, of course, not enough. As you can see, she's down to 50% health. All of these shots coming in from all of these thunderers. Great job there, focusing down on that leadership. Try to get rid of it nice and early. Try to get rid of that magical support nice and early as well. At the same time, you can see over here, these Dwarf Warriors are having a terrible time trying to close the gap to these Dark Shards with shields, and absolutely failing at it, of course, presenting their backs to these Dark Shards over here. But these Dark Shards are about to get closed down as well, thanks to these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. So good split there from both players. Braccus Rex here sort of seeing the situation, trying to split up the skirmishing units, while the Dwarfs as well seeing that very same situation and split up these chasing units, trying to prevent the very support that was happening over here. But you can see these Dwarf Warriors are already more or less taken care of. All it will take now is a couple of swings from some Hargoneth Executioners, who, as you can see, are trying to close the gap right now. Meanwhile, over here, we actually have these Giant Slayers able to take care of these Dark Shards. Again, the Giant Slayers are faster, so the Dark Shards now being cut down, while back here you can see the Runesmith using the Rune of Oath and Steel just to try and keep himself and the Longbeards behind him protected, I think, while this Runesmith continues to give chase to these Bolt Fiends as well. Again, trying to shut down that range support. The Supreme Sorceress continues to get fired upon, but right now turning around and trying to focus in on this situation over here, trying to save these Dark Shards. She wants to dive in and cause some damage to these Dwarf Warriors and maybe ultimately get them to break and rout, perhaps shatter, maybe Terror kicks in, and there you have it. They do give up on the fight, while over here you can see once more a beautiful split. These Dark Shards pulled down here, these pulled up there, and these Dwarf Warriors have to pick. They have to now chase after this one, while another unit of Dwarf Warriors now has to go and get isolated and chase after these Dark Shards with shields. But you can see the balance of power, despite all this splitting and the Terror kicking off, you can see the balance of power is very much in favor of the Dwarfs. And down here, meanwhile, these Hargoneth Executioners have given up on chasing these Dwarf Warriors because the Supreme Sorceress is dealing with them, and instead are coming down here to deal with these Giant Slayers, as well as these Longbeards and the Runesmith that are closing the gap towards this Lonely Reaper Bolt Thrower. It hasn't killed that many units just yet, but it has caused a fair bit of damage, so don't let that kill count fool you. It's been doing a fair bit of work. And off to the right over here, you can see the Bolt Fiends. They were just hit by the Rune of Wrath and Ruin, and so that slowed them down a fair bit, allowing the Runesmith again to close that gap. The speed difference is 32 to 33, so all it takes is a little bit of an angle difference, a little bit of a misclick or a misdecision or a slightly late click, and the Runesmith will be able to close the gap. The Rune of Wrath and Ruin, of course, was helping significantly because of that reduction in speed, while back here, as all that was happening, we actually have the Doomfire Warlocks able to sort of cut through the gap over here and dive right into these Thunderers. The Thunderers were far too distracted by the Supreme Sorceress, and so these Slaanesha's Harvesters were not stopped on their approach there, while back here you can see as these Dwarf Warriors with their great weapons continue to try and close the gap here. The Dark Shards just turn around and open some shots, hoping to get a little bit of damage in, while these Dark Shards now are again free to fire away at these Dwarf Warriors if they so choose. The Supreme Sorceress decides to pull back as well and take to the air and maybe stay safe. She's very low on health, so she does have to be careful. Well, over here you can see we do have the Slaanesha's Harvesters now surrounded by the Lord, and a lot of that Thunderer fire coming in as well, causing a fair bit of damage. These Slaanesha's Harvesters are not going to last a very long time under all of that gunfire. They have a fairly high physical resistance, of course, but it's not going to do all that much, and we're going to get some magical support coming in here as well. Soul Stealer comes down to try and keep those Slaanesha's Harvesters alive, but that might not be enough as they are fully surrounded. We've got these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons coming in as well to try and pin them in place, I think, as the Thunderers continue to fire away. And you can see the Reaper Bolt Thrower also continues to fire away, focusing in on these Thunderers, trying to remove that very threatening range support, while back here, again, we've got those Hargoneth Executioners trying to close the gaps to these Giant Slayers back here, as well as these Longbeards and the Runesmith up here. You can see we do have the Rune of Wrath and Ruin slowing down these Hargoneth Executioners significantly, and also, of course, causing some damage, while up here, the Supreme Sorceress is looking for an opportunity to get involved somewhere, slow down some units, but of course she has to be very careful around Giant Slayers. They are very threatening anti-large and armor-piercing units. Back here, meanwhile, you can see the Dwarf Warriors having a bit of a field day, diving into these Dark Shards, but these Dark Shards continue to fire into these Dwarf Warriors, hoping to scare them off, while off in the distance, these Dark Shards need to pull away once more to get away from these threatening Dwarf Warriors with great weapons who are insisting on closing the gap there. While over here, you can see once again the Slaanesha's Harvesters giving up on the fight. They didn't really stand much of a chance. They are routing. They're very low on health, about half dead in terms of unit count as well, so they do need to get out of there in a precarious situation they were thrown. At the same time, you can see the Runesmith on that right flank ultimately giving up on the chase against the Bolt Fiends, wanted to get involved over here instead. Not the best idea, and you can see the Supreme Sorceress actually decides to get involved rather intimately with the Runesmith, throwing him back and causing a touch of damage, hoping to eliminate some of that runic support, and that's not a bad idea at all. As you can see over here as well, the Runesmith pops the Rune of Negation and the Rune of Oath and Steel, trying to help some of these Hargoneth Executioners out and help himself as well as he dives into the Hargoneth Executioners, while over here you can see again, we're going to get some magical support from that Supreme Sorceress of Fire, and take a look at the amount of damage it does as these Hargoneth Executioners hold these guys in place. We get all of those bolts coming down and causing a significant amount of damage to these Longbeards, helping massively for these Hargoneth Executioners in that engagement. And you can see over here these Slaanesh Harvesters once more willing to fight. They have rallied while off in the distance in the trees. You can see these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons continuing to give chase to these Dark Shards. And now we have Murderous Prowess active, so all of these melee engagements are going to turn very swiftly in favor of the Dark Elves. As you can see, these Longbeards giving up, melting away. The Giant Slayers as well, not really having a good time. They're already dead. The Runesmith over here as well, willing to give up on the fight, routing now, and the Reaper Bolt Thrower continues to fire away, trying to get some damage into these Dwarf Warriors. A beautiful clump being presented here, while the Bolt Fiends are able to fire away at these Thunderers as they are trying to get into range. And you can see we've got some Shatters kicking off now. Routes back here, another Shatter with this Runesmith over here as well. This Runesmith as well willing to give up on the fight, so the Runic support is disappearing very quickly. The Supreme Sorceress has done a lot of very good work using magic and, of course, her physical capabilities as well atop that dragon. And you can see the Bolt Fiends here absolutely reducing these Thunderers, getting them to melt away, while the Reaper Bolt Thrower continues to fire away at these Thunderers. Again, beautifully clumped up here. Great spot to fire into for this artillery. And now finally you can see we've got the Dwarf Lord here trying to close the gap, trying to get into the Reaper Bolt Thrower and prevent more of that supporting fire from coming in. The Hargoneth Executioners are too busy dealing with these Dwarf Warriors, and up front you can see once again we're going to get a little bit of magical support. The Thunderers do try to get away, but unfortunately they're just a little too late as the Supreme Sorceress brings in that beautiful Firestorm. You can see they're getting tossed around, being set alight. It must be really hot inside that armor of theirs, and at the same time, as if insult to injury, salt upon the wound, we have the Reaper Bolt Thrower still able to fire into that massive clump of Thunderers, despite the fact that the Dwarf Lord is actually right upon them. And right behind those Reaper Bolt Throwers, though, you can see we have these Hargoneth Executioners able to respond. Murderous Prowess and Murderous Mastery, in this case, still very much active, able to go in there and completely melt away the Lord, possibly, while off in the woods you can see Slaanesh's Harvesters again having a bit of a tough time holding these Dwarf Warriors in place, but that's okay because tactically it does work out, allowing these Dark Shards to open fire and again remove another unit from the Dwarven army. But you can see Shatters across the field, many routes, these Thunderers giving up on the fight again over here as well. We've got the Lord now in a bit of a precarious situation. The Hargoneth Executioners having a good time with the Rune of Wrath and Ruin here, slowing them down, and of course, more importantly, causing a little bit of damage as this Runesmith has decided to return to the fray. The Supreme Sorceress looking for another opportunity to dive in, while up front you can see these Hargoneth Executioners are having an absolute field day in eliminating these Longbeards. The Bolt Fiends that were left alive by the Runesmith earlier are also having a field day, just trying to get these Thunderers to give up on the fight, while the Supreme Sorceress, as you can see, dives into these Thunderers back here, just ensuring that these Thunderers are not able to fire away. And you can see across the board, the Thunderers are still basically at full ammunition. They have barely had a chance to open fire. They've barely done any damage. So wonderfully done there by the Dark Elves. And over here as well, you can see despite the Runesmith coming in with the Rune of Negation and the Rune of Oath and Steel, the Lord is in a terrible situation. The Reaper Bolt Thrower crew actually able to hold its ground here as the Hargoneth Executioners and these Dark Shards decide to dive in to provide some assistance. The Lord giving up on the fight over here, routing, and the Runesmith as well, very low on health, deciding to rout, has less than 150 hit points, can be eliminated by a volley or two from these Dark Shards if they are accurate enough. And you can see back here these Bolt Fiends, perhaps ironically it had to be the Bolt Fiends that decide to open fire at the Runesmith. He is very low on health, very close to death, while back here again the Supreme Sorceress decides to dive in and intercepts these Longbeards. Very beautifully done there, great awareness shown there, making sure that the Bolt Fiends do not get shut down and they're able to continue firing away. While over here as well you can see the Lord is in a terrible situation, routing, being chased by the Hargoneth Executioners, but all of these Dwarf Warriors are now able to push away from the trees. They've taken care of all of those Dark Shards for the most part, and these Hargoneth Executioners are given the task of intercepting the incoming charges. The Dwarfs maybe can still turn this around. You can see off in the distance as well we have these Thunderers willing to fight and fire once more, and off in the distance here you can see these Dark Shards are being taken care of between the Thunderers as well as these Dwarf Warriors with their great weapons. But of course the Supreme Sorceress has something to say about that. She wants to get in there and rescue her Dark Shards, maybe cause some damage, cause some fear and terror perhaps. And over here again these Longbeards continue to melt away at the hand of those Hargoneth Executioners. But over here you can see the Bolt Fiends now firing away, trying to get rid of this clump as these Giant Slayers dive into the Hargoneth Executioners. But of course the Hargoneth Executioners aren't going to mind this situation. The Reaper Bolt Thrower as well firing into this beautiful clump that's forming up, and we've got these nearly full health Hargoneth Executioners coming in for a rear charge as well. These Dwarf Warriors though turn around to intercept that incoming rear charge just to avoid some of that morale damage it would cause. But take a look at these Giant Slayers just melt away under all of that range support. And off in the distance once more you can see the Supreme Sorceress does manage to rescue these Dark Shards, so they do decide to rout ultimately. She's able to get in there and scare off these Thunderers, and she might have been wise to dive into these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons, but again, they're not the primary threat here. She decides to pull back and find another place to get engaged, while the Bolt Fiends again continue to fire away into these Thunderers, and that is the mistake of the Runesmith, keeping these Bolt Fiends alive. They're causing so much damage now, 66 kills, and causing so much morale damage. As you can see, these Thunderers are being scared off, while over here as well, these Dwarf Warriors with great weapons completely scared off, not really willing to stick around and fight, while these Giant Slayers decided to shut down the Dark Shards over here, which is not a bad idea at all. but that might just be far too little, far too late. You can see we have the Supreme Sorceress moving in, seemingly to respond to just that threat, popping Arcane Conduit as well. Unfortunately, these Dark Shards do fall apart, and over here you can see these Hargoneth Executioners chasing after these Dwarf Warriors over here, these Longbeards, sorry, as they close the gap to the Reaper Bolt Thrower crew, because they are basically out of ammunition now. In comes the Supreme Sorceress to intercept and eliminate these Longbeards, while the Hargoneth Executioners pull in towards this clump over here, trying to get a nice rear charge into these Dwarf Warriors and these Giant Slayers as well, to eliminate what's left of the Dwarven army. Of course, over here, these Bolt Fiends are being shut down as well by the Dwarf Warriors with great weapons who are trying to close the gap, but we've got these Hargoneth Executioners trying to push in and eliminate these Dwarf Warriors, while the Thunderers try to fire away at these Bolt Fiends. The Bolt Fiends trying to stay alive here with 94 kills to their name. A beautifully used unit there, great management over there. You can see the Reaper Bolt Thrower once more at its equipment, able to turn around and open fire, and again, just eliminate what's left of these Thunderers. Another Fireball comes through now to try and finish off these Thunderers that are harassing some of those Bolt Fiends, and you can see a beautiful shot there, eliminating these Dwarfs again, making it really hot over here, and ultimately, the Dwarfs give up on the fight. The Giant Slayers are all they have left, still willing to fight, unbreakable as they are. They get their wish of death. I thought this was a really interesting battle, largely due to the deployment from the Dark Elves and the willingness of the Dwarfs to give chase across the map. On many occasions, the Dwarfs were able to close gaps using the right runes and the right units, but unfortunately the Dark Elves were on average much faster, and the excellent micromanagement on the Dark Shards meant bolts were flying constantly from multiple directions, whittling away at a variety of troops. The Reaper Bolt Thrower was allowed to fire for far too long as well, netting just over 50 kills at the end of the day, but to be honest, each part of the Dark Elf army contributed in one way or another. As always, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more Total War content and keep sending in those battle replays. I do think it's one of the best ways to learn, and it's always nice to highlight such amazing battles from the community. I'd also like to thank all of my patrons for supporting the channel on a month-to-month basis. It makes a huge difference in keeping the channel alive and running smoothly, and I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you on the battlefield.